Some things aren't thrown away because they're useless, but because they remind others what they've lost. The desert didn't sleep. It whispered, a low, endless hiss of wind dragging grains of glass-fine sand across the cracked surface like static over a dead radio. And under a sky bleached pale by twin suns, something still breathed where nothing should. A single shape half-buried, barely visible unless you were looking for it, which no one was, because no one ever came back here. Not after the convoys finished their work, not after the word, discarded, was logged and sealed and forgotten, but she hadn't stopped breathing, not yet. Each inhale shallow, mechanical, like her body had forgotten how but refused to quit anyway. Her skin, faintly blue beneath layers of dust, caught the light in soft pulses, almost like it was remembering something the desert wanted erased, and miles away, cutting across that same wasteland, a transport truck rumbled forward on worn suspension, its tires grinding over hardened ridges as Daniel Hayes kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting near the console, eyes forward, jaw tight, the kind of silence that follows a life that used to be louder, the cab filled with low engine vibration and the occasional ping from a struggling cooling unit. 104 degrees outside. Pushing higher, the system flashed a warning. He ignored it. He ignored most things these days. The job didn't ask questions, and neither did he. Just miles, schedules, deliveries, repeat. The road ahead shimmered in heat distortion, empty except for one flicker, something out of place, something vertical in a place that should have been flat. His eyes narrowed slightly. The truck rolled closer, and for a second, just a second, he saw it clearly, a shape in the sand, too still to be alive, too deliberate to be random, and then it passed behind him, swallowed by distance. Daniel didn't slow down, didn't turn his head. His grip on the wheel stayed steady. The truck kept moving, engine humming, like nothing had happened at all, because out here, nothing usually did, because out here, stopping meant risk, meant questions, meant getting involved, and he had learned, long before this desert, long before this job, that involvement had a cost, the kind that didn't go away, the kind that stayed with you in the quiet moments when the engine died and the world stopped moving. So he kept driving, mile marker blinking past on the HUD, 10 miles to the next relay point, fuel at 60%, systems holding, everything normal, everything fine, except it wasn't, not really, because the image didn't leave, it stayed there, sharp and unwanted, a head in the sand, eyes that might have been open, might have been watching, might have been waiting, and the more he tried to push it down, the louder it got, until the silence in the cab felt heavier than the desert outside, until his hand tightened just a little too much on the wheel, until the engine's hum wasn't enough to drown it out anymore. And at exactly 200 yards past where he'd seen it, Daniel Hayes exhaled slowly, long and controlled, like he was bracing for something he already understood. His foot eased off the accelerator, just slightly, just enough for the truck to begin losing speed, and for the first time in a long time, the road ahead didn't feel like the only direction left to go. The truck rolled another 20 yards before the engine note dropped, a subtle shift in pitch that made the silence inside the cab feel louder than the desert itself. And Daniel Hayes let his foot hover over the pedal for a second longer than necessary, as if waiting for a reason not to do what he was about to do. But no warning came, no signal, just the low hum of machinery and the dry hiss of wind scraping against the metal frame. So he exhaled again, slower this time, and turned the wheel. The heavy vehicle responding with a reluctant groan as it pivoted off its straight path and began carving a wide arc through the sand, tires pressing deep tracks into a place that erased everything eventually, the horizon shifting as the truck faced back the way it had come. And for a moment, he just sat there, engine idling, looking out through the dust-streaked windshield at the stretch of land he had already chosen to leave behind, his fingers drumming once against the steering wheel before going still, because this was the part that mattered, not the turning, not the driving, but the decision to keep going. And then he pressed the accelerator again, steady, controlled, the truck moving forward with purpose now, retracing the distance yard by yard, each second bringing the image back into focus until the shape appeared again in the wavering heat, smaller than he remembered, more fragile, almost like it had already started to disappear, and he slowed the truck to a crawl as he approached, the engine dropping to a low idle, dust settling around him in slow drifting curtains, until he finally brought it to a stop about 10 feet away, close enough to see clearly, far enough to leave space if this turned into something it should not, the cabin ticking softly as the engine cooled, and Daniel did not move right away. He just sat there with both hands resting on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead, taking in the details now that there was no distance left to soften them. The sand was packed tight around her, shaped deliberately, not by nature but by design, her head exposed, angled slightly toward the sky as if someone had decided that was the most efficient way to leave her here. Her skin carried that faint blue hue beneath the dust, not bright, not glowing, just present enough to confirm she was not human, and her breathing, if it could be called that, came in shallow intervals, spaced just far enough apart to make each one uncertain, the kind of rhythm that did not promise anything beyond the next second. And for a brief moment Daniel felt that familiar pull to stay where he was, to let the scene remain exactly as it was without interfering, because unchanged meant safe. Unchanged meant no consequences. But then something shifted, not in the environment, not in the wind or the light, but in the smallest movement of her face, a flicker so slight it could have been nothing at all. Except it was not, because her eyes opened just enough to catch the reflection of his truck, just enough to register that something had returned, and they did not hold fear, they did not hold expectation, they held something quieter, something closer to resignation, like she had already counted the outcome and accepted it, and that was the moment that made his decision for him. Daniel reached for the door handle, paused once as the heat reading on the console flashed 107 degrees, then pushed the door open anyway, the outside air hitting him like a wall of dry pressure as he stepped down onto the sand, boots sinking slightly with each step, the wind tugging at his jacket, carrying that constant whisper across the empty space. And as he walked closer, he could hear it more clearly now, not the wind, but the faint uneven sound of her breathing, still there, still continuing, and he stopped just a few feet away, looking down at her, the distance between them no longer measured in yards or miles, but in a single choice. One that he had already made the moment he turned the truck around, and without saying a word, without asking a question, Daniel Hayes knelt into the heat of the sand and reached forward with both hands. The sand burned through the fabric of his gloves as soon as his hands touched it, heat radiating upward in waves that made the air shimmer around his arms. But Daniel did not pull back. He leaned forward instead, fingers digging into the packed surface where the grains had fused together under days of relentless sun, the texture rough and stubborn as if the desert itself had agreed to keep her there. And for a second he paused, not because of the effort, but because of the closeness now. Because from this distance she was no longer just a shape in the distance. She was a person, her features sharper, the faint pattern beneath her blue skin catching the light in subtle lines that seemed almost intentional, like circuitry or memory etched into something living, and her eyes, half open, shifted toward him again, tracking his movement with slow, deliberate focus, not confusion, not fear, just awareness, as if she had already decided that whatever happened next would not surprise her. Daniel cleared his throat once, the sound dry and unused, and spoke without thinking, his voice low and steady. "Hold on." Two simple words that felt heavier than they should, because he was not sure who he was saying them for, her or himself. And then he started digging, pushing his hands deeper into the sand, breaking apart the hardened layers inch by inch, each movement sending small avalanches sliding down around her neck and shoulders, careful not to collapse too much at once, careful not to shift her position abruptly, because even without knowing her biology, he understood enough to know that stability mattered, that sudden changes could do more harm than help. So he worked slowly, methodically, ignoring the sting in his hands, ignoring the sweat collecting under his collar, the sun pressing down like a constant weight on his back. The only rhythm now was his breathing and hers, his steady, hers fragile, and as he cleared more space around her shoulders, the sand began to loosen, revealing more of her form beneath, a thin layer of dust giving way to smoother skin that carried that same faint luminescence, dim but present, like something trying not to be noticed, and she moved slightly. Then, not a struggle, not resistance, just a small adjustment as if responding to the change in pressure, and a soft sound escaped her, not quite a word, more like a breath shaped into something almost meaningful. Daniel froze for a fraction of a second, watching her face for any sign that he was causing harm. But her expression remained the same, calm in a way that did not belong in a place like this. And then, slowly, she spoke, her voice barely above the wind, each syllable spaced out as if pulled from somewhere deep and distant. You should not return. The words carried no accusation, no urgency, just a quiet statement of fact. And Daniel let out a small breath through his nose, almost a humorless laugh, his hands never stopping their work as he answered. Yeah, I get that a lot. The reply simple, almost automatic, but it grounded him, gave the moment something human to hold on to, and he kept digging, widening the space, freeing more of her upper body until the sand no longer pressed tightly against her chest, giving her room to breathe a little easier. And he reached for the canteen clipped to his belt, unscrewing the cap with practiced motion before holding it near her lips, hesitating just long enough to make sure she could take it. Small sips. He said quietly, not knowing if she would understand, but trusting that tone carried more than words, and her eyes shifted to the container, then back to him, studying him for a brief moment as if recalibrating something. Unseen, before she accepted, the smallest tilt of her head enough to guide the water, and he watched carefully, making sure not to give too much too fast, the liquid disappearing past her lips as her breathing steadied just slightly, not fixed, not safe, but improved, and for the first time since he had stepped out of the truck, Daniel felt the weight of the decision settle into something solid, something real, because this was no longer about turning around or not. This was about staying, about finishing what he had already started, and as he set the canteen aside and returned both hands to the sand, digging deeper, working to free the rest of her from the desert that had been so ready to forget her, he realized that whatever this was, whatever she was not something to be left behind. The sand gave way slower the deeper he went, each handful heavier than the last, as if the ground itself resisted the idea of release. But Daniel kept working, shifting his weight, bracing one knee against the heat as he carved out space around her torso. Careful, deliberate, the kind of care that came from instinct more than knowledge. And as more of her form emerged, he noticed the structure beneath the dust, not armor, not clothing in any human sense, but something integrated, a thin layer that followed the contours of her body like a second skin, faint lines pulsing dimly along its surface, reacting to movement, to air, maybe even to him. And he slowed for a moment, eyes narrowing as he studied it, not out of fear, but out of recognition that this was not something broken, not something useless. Whatever label had been assigned to her out here, it did not match what he was seeing now. And she seemed to notice his hesitation, her gaze lifting slightly, focusing on his face with more clarity than before, her breathing still uneven but steadier than it had been minutes ago. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a little more strength, though still soft enough to be carried away by the wind if he had not been so close. You are altering outcome. The phrasing careful, precise, like each word had been selected rather than spoken, and Daniel shook his head slightly, a faint crease forming between his brows as he continued digging. I am just getting you out of the sand, he replied, keeping his tone even, grounded, because anything more complicated felt unnecessary, and she watched him for a second longer before her eyes shifted away, not dismissive, not disengaged, but thoughtful, as if processing something he could not see. And he returned his focus to the task, clearing space around her midsection now, the sand loosening enough that he could begin to feel the shape of her beneath it, the resistance changing, less rigid, more granular, and he adjusted his approach, using slower movements to avoid sudden shifts, because the last thing he wanted was to destabilize whatever fragile balance was keeping her conscious. And the sun climbed higher, the temperature inside his suit rising with it, sweat tracing slow lines down his back, his breath coming a little heavier with each motion. But he did not stop, because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking would mean questioning, and questioning would slow him down, and she did not have time for that. So he kept going, inch by inch, until finally the pressure around her torso released enough that her body shifted slightly on its own, a small, involuntary movement that drew a sharper breath from her. And Daniel froze again, watching closely, ready to adjust if needed. But she did not pull away, did not resist, Instead, her eyes returned to him, sharper now, more present, and there was something new in them, not gratitude, not yet, but curiosity, the kind that had not been there before, and she spoke again, the words clearer this time, spaced but deliberate. Why continue? And he let out a quiet breath, almost a sigh, not from exhaustion but from the weight of the question, because it was not a simple one, not really, but his answer was. Because you are still here, he said, meeting her gaze for a brief moment before returning to his work, as if that explained everything, and in a way, it did, because presence meant possibility, and possibility was enough, and he reached deeper now, working to free the remaining sand from around her lower body, knowing it would take more effort, more time, but also knowing that he was already committed. That turning back was no longer an option he recognized, and as the wind shifted slightly, carrying a different tone across the open desert, a faint mechanical hum far in the distance that did not belong to the natural world, Daniel's head tilted just slightly, his attention flickering for a fraction of a second toward the horizon before returning to her, his movements becoming just a little more urgent, not rushed, not careless, but focused in a way that suggested he understood something was changing, even if he did not say it out loud, and the desert, which had been content to whisper until now, seemed to hold its breath. The hum in the distance did not fade this time. It grew, low at first, almost easy to mistake for wind moving across metal, but steady in a way the desert never was, and Daniel heard it clearly now as he dug, the sound threading through the air like a warning that did not need translation. His hands did not stop, but his movements tightened, more efficient, less exploratory, as if he had shifted from helping to finishing, and the sand around her lower body began to loosen faster under his effort, sliding away in small cascades that exposed more of that strange second skin layer, the faint lines along it pulsing slightly brighter now, responding to something unseen, maybe her rising awareness, maybe the change in her environment, or maybe the approaching sound. And she noticed it too, her eyes shifting past him toward the horizon, focus sharpening with a clarity that had not been there before, and when she spoke, her voice was steadier, still quiet, but no longer fading. They are returning. The words carried no panic, just certainty, and Daniel exhaled once, short and controlled, as if that confirmed what he already knew, his gaze flicking briefly toward the distant ridge where the sound originated, a faint shimmer now visible above the sand, movement against the stillness, then back to her. Yeah, he said, almost under his breath, and he shifted his stance, planting his boots more firmly as he reached deeper, working to free her legs from the packed ground. The resistance stronger here, the sand denser, shaped deliberately to hold, but it was breaking now, inch by inch, and as he cleared enough space, her body responded, a slight shift, then another, the first signs that she could move on her own if given the chance, and he leaned back just enough to give her room, watching carefully as she tested that freedom, her movements controlled, minimal, as if she was measuring her own limits, recalibrating after being held in place for too long, and for a moment the only sound between them was the wind and that growing hum, closer now, layered with a faint mechanical rhythm that did not belong to anything natural, and Daniel stood, brushing sand from his hands as he took a half step back, not retreating, just creating space, his eyes scanning her quickly, assessing without overthinking, and then he reached down again, offering his hand, not forcing, not pulling, just there, steady, an option rather than a command, and she looked at it, her gaze moving from his hand to his face and back again, something shifting behind her eyes as if the gesture itself required interpretation, not because she did not understand it, but because she was not used to it being offered without condition, and after a brief pause, she placed her hand in his, her grip lighter than expected but precise, and he felt the faint warmth of her skin, different but not unfamiliar, and he adjusted his hold carefully, supporting rather than lifting as she moved, her body rising from the sand with a slow, deliberate motion, unsteady for only a second before stabilizing, and when she stood, she was taller than he had expected, her posture straightening as if remembering itself, the faint glow along her skin lines becoming more defined now, not bright, but present in a way that made her impossible to mistake for anything discarded, and the sound in the distance grew louder, resolving into something unmistakable now. Engines, multiple, approaching fast, and Daniel turned his head fully this time, eyes narrowing against the glare as shapes began to form against the horizon. Small at first, then clearer, angular silhouettes cutting through the heat distortion, and he looked back at her, just once. No hesitation in his voice as he spoke. "We are leaving." Not a question, not a suggestion, just a direction, and for a brief moment she held his gaze, something new settling into her expression, not confusion, not resistance, but understanding, and she nodded, just slightly, enough to say she was with him, and Daniel turned toward the truck, already calculating distance, time, and everything in between, knowing they did not have much of either, but moving anyway, because stopping was no longer an option, not for him, and not for her. The truck door slammed shut behind them with a solid metallic thud that seemed louder than it should have been, the sound cutting through the wind just as the distant engines grew sharper, more defined, and Daniel was already moving before the echo faded, his hand reaching for the ignition controls as he guided her into the passenger seat, steady but efficient, not rushing her, but not slowing either, because every second now had weight. The engine responded with a low rumble that vibrated through the frame, familiar and grounding, and he shifted the vehicle into motion, the tires biting into the sand as they pulled away from the shallow pit that had nearly become her grave, the desert stretching out ahead of them in long waves of heat distortion. But behind them the shapes were no longer distant, no longer abstract. 3 aerial units cutting low across the horizon, their movement precise, deliberate, closing the gap faster than anything on the ground could outrun for long. And Daniel kept his eyes forward, hands steady on the wheel, adjusting course slightly to avoid the deeper ridges where the sand would slow them down, the truck bouncing over uneven terrain as the suspension absorbed the impact with dull mechanical groans, and beside him she sat upright, not slumped, not weak in the way he had expected, her posture controlled, her breathing still measured but stronger now, the faint lines along her skin glowing just a little brighter inside the dim interior of the cab, reflecting softly against the dashboard. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the engine, the wind, and the rising pitch of the approaching craft, until she turned her head toward him, her gaze steady, analyzing. "You calculate escape probability," she said, not as a question but as an observation, and Daniel let out a quiet breath through his nose, eyes flicking briefly to the side mirror where the distant shapes were growing larger. "I calculate how long until they catch up," he replied, his tone even, practical, and she seemed to consider that, her head tilting slightly as if aligning her understanding with his words. "Outcome remains unchanged," she said after a moment, and there was no defeat in it, just clarity, the kind that came from seeing variables he could not, and Daniel gave a small nod, almost imperceptible. "Maybe," he said, his grip tightening slightly on the wheel as he adjusted their heading again, angling toward a line of rocky formations in the distance that broke the otherwise open landscape. Not much cover, but better than nothing, and she followed his gaze, tracking the shift in direction, her eyes narrowing slightly as if mapping the terrain in ways he could not. And then something subtle changed, the faint glow along her skin pulsing once, a little brighter, and the console beside him flickered, just for a second, a brief distortion across the display before stabilizing, and Daniel glanced at it instinctively, then back at her, a question forming but not spoken, because the answer was already there in the way her attention had shifted inward, focused, as if she was interacting with something beyond the visible, and the truck's engine notes smoothed slightly, the irregular vibration easing into a more efficient rhythm, small, almost unnoticeable, but real, and Daniel exhaled quietly, not commenting, just accepting the change for what it was, because whatever she was not passive, not broken, and definitely not useless. And the sound behind them grew louder still, now close enough that he could feel the pressure shift in the air, the presence of something moving faster than it should across open sky. And he did not look back this time, because looking would not change anything, only moving would, and he pressed the accelerator a little further, the truck responding with a deeper growl as it surged forward across the desert, carrying them both toward whatever came next, not because it was safe, but because it was the only direction left that still meant something. The terrain ahead rose in jagged ridges of dark stone, heat shimmering along their edges like a mirage that refused to disappear, and Daniel guided the truck toward it with precise adjustments, each turn calculated to keep momentum while avoiding the softer pockets of sand that could slow them just enough to matter. The engine pushing harder now, its steady growl layered with the distant thunder of the pursuing craft closing in behind them. And inside the cab the air felt tighter, charged with something more than heat, a pressure that came from being watched, tracked, measured, and he did not need to look in the mirror to know they were closer. He could feel it in the way the ground seemed to hum beneath the tires, in the subtle vibration that passed through the steering column into his hands. And beside him she remained still but not passive, her eyes focused ahead, then briefly to the side, then back again, mapping, calculating, and the faint glow along her skin shifted in rhythm, not random, not decorative, but functional. And when she spoke this time her voice carried a steadiness that had not been there before. "You seek obstruction," she said, her gaze fixed on the rocky outcropping ahead, and Daniel gave a slight nod, eyes narrowing as he evaluated the path between two large formations that formed a narrow passage. "Slows them down," he replied, simple, direct, and she considered that for a fraction of a second before responding. Not enough, and there was no challenge in her tone, just information, and Daniel let out a small breath, the corner of his mouth tightening just slightly. "It does not have to be enough," he said, adjusting the wheel as the truck hit a rough patch, the suspension absorbing the impact with a heavy jolt that rattled the dashboard. "It just has to be something." And the words hung there for a moment. Not dramatic, not profound, just honest. And she looked at him then, not at the road, not at the horizon, but at him, studying the way he held the wheel, the way his focus never wavered even as the situation narrowed around them. And something shifted in her expression again, subtle but present, as if a variable had changed in her understanding. And then she turned her attention forward once more, her hand lifting slightly from her side, hovering just above the console without touching it, and the lights flickered again, more noticeably this time, the display recalibrating in a rapid sequence of adjustments that Daniel did not initiate, the engine response smoothing further, power distribution shifting in ways that made the vehicle feel lighter, more responsive, and he did not question it, did not interrupt, he simply adapted, adjusting his driving to match the change, pushing the truck harder as they approached the narrow pass. The rocks rising on either side now, cutting off the wide, open exposure of the desert, and replacing it with tight angles and shadowed gaps. And behind them the sound of the pursuing craft intensified, a sharp mechanical tone slicing through the air as they closed the distance. And for the first time Daniel glanced at the mirror, just a quick look, enough to confirm what he already knew. The shapes were larger now, defined, angular forms moving with precision, tracking their path directly. And he looked forward again immediately, focusing on the path ahead as the truck entered the pass, the space narrowing, the margin for error shrinking with every yard. And beside him she spoke again, her voice quieter now, but more certain than before. "They will not stop." And Daniel gave a short nod, his grip firm, his posture steady. "Neither will we," he answered. And the truck surged forward into the shadow of the rocks, carrying them into a space where the desert could no longer see them clearly, but whatever was following still could, and the distance between pursuit and escape had never felt smaller. The truck burst out of the narrow passage into a wider basin of broken stone and wind-swept dust, the sudden openness revealing a landscape carved by time into uneven ridges and shallow drops, a place where visibility shifted with every angle and shadows stretched longer than they should. And Daniel did not slow. He adjusted, guiding the vehicle along the natural contours of the terrain, using the dips and rises to break line of sight, the engine holding strong beneath him, smoother now than before, almost as if it was anticipating his movements. And behind them the pursuing craft followed, their presence no longer just sound but pressure, a constant weight pressing forward through the air, tracking, adapting, and inside the cab the light flickered again, not erratic this time, but controlled, the displays recalibrating in sequences that Daniel had not programmed, data shifting across the screen too fast to read, but stabilizing into something more coherent, more precise, and he did not need to ask who was responsible, because beside him she had changed, not in form but in presence. Her posture straighter, her breathing even, the faint lines along her skin now glowing in a steady pattern that pulsed in quiet synchronization with the systems around them. And when she spoke, her voice no longer carried strain, it carried clarity. "Their tracking is pattern-based," she said, her gaze fixed forward but her awareness extending beyond what he could see. "They predict movement from terrain response." And Daniel listened, not questioning, because the way she spoke left no room for doubt. "So we break the pattern," he replied, already adjusting his approach, shifting from direct navigation to something less predictable, cutting across the terrain at sharper angles, letting the truck slide slightly before correcting, using irregular movement instead of efficiency. And the effect was immediate, subtle but real, the pressure behind them shifting, the sound of the engines no longer perfectly aligned with their path. And she nodded once, a small confirmation. "Continue," she said, and her hand moved closer to the console, not touching but influencing. The systems responding again with slight recalibrations that enhanced the vehicle's responsiveness. The steering more precise, the engine output more balanced, and Daniel adapted instantly, pushing the truck harder now, weaving through the uneven landscape with controlled intensity, each movement intentional, each correction exact, and for a moment the distance between them and the pursuers did not close. It held, a fragile equilibrium that could break at any second, and the wind outside shifted again, carrying fine particles of sand that streaked across the windshield in thin, fast lines, reducing visibility just enough to matter. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, narrowing his focus, trusting the terrain, trusting his instincts, and beside him she spoke again, quieter this time, not directed at him, but spoken as if stating a truth she had just confirmed. "They removed me because I retained what they erased." And Daniel did not look at her, not yet, his attention still on the path ahead, but he heard it, every word. "Memories are inefficient," she continued, her voice steady. "They create hesitation, empathy, deviation from optimal outcomes." And there was no emotion in the statement, just observation, and Daniel let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. "Yeah," he said, eyes still forward. "That sounds about right." And the truck hit another ridge, lifting slightly before settling back down, the suspension absorbing the impact as they continued forward. And for a moment there was silence between them again, not empty, not tense, but filled with something unspoken, something that did not need explanation. And then she turned her head toward him, her gaze steady, more human now than it had been before, and she said, "You returned despite inefficiency." And Daniel finally glanced at her, just briefly, before returning his focus to the road. "Guess I am not built for optimal outcomes," he replied, and for the first time, the faintest shift touched her expression. Not a smile, not quite, but something close, something that had not been there before and behind them. The engines adjusted again, adapting to their new pattern, closing the gap once more, and the fragile balance broke, and Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel, pushing forward, because whatever came next, stopping was still not an option. The basin narrowed again ahead, not into a clean passage but into a fractured rise of stone that forced the terrain upward, uneven and unstable, a place where speed would cost control and control would cost time. And Daniel saw it all in a single glance, the angles, the risks, the lack of options, and he did not hesitate. He adjusted, guiding the truck toward the incline as the engines behind them surged louder, closer now than at any point before, the pressure in the air tightening like a closing grip. And beside him she was still, but not passive, her focus no longer divided, no longer searching. It had settled into something clear, something resolved, and the glow along her skin shifted again, brighter now, not enough to overwhelm, but enough to illuminate the edges of the cabin in soft blue lines that pulsed with a steady rhythm. And the console responded in kind, stabilizing further, systems aligning in ways that felt less like assistance and more like synchronization. And Daniel pushed the truck harder, the engine roaring as they climbed the uneven slope, the tires slipping once before catching again, the entire frame shuddering under the strain, and he leaned into it, both hands firm on the wheel, guiding rather than forcing, because forcing would break something, and he could not afford that. Not now, not this close. And the sound behind them shifted again, sharper, more direct. The pursuing craft adjusting to the terrain, matching their trajectory with precision, and Daniel knew then that the distance they had gained was gone, that whatever came next would not be about outrunning. And for the first time since this began, he let that reality settle without resistance, without denial, just acceptance. And he eased off the accelerator slightly as they reached the crest, the truck leveling out on a narrow plateau of cracked stone, the path ahead dropping off into another stretch of desert, wide and open, nowhere left to hide. And he slowed the vehicle to a stop, the engine idling low, steady, the sound of it grounding in a way the world outside no longer was, and for a moment he just sat there, hands still on the wheel, eyes forward, breathing even, as the engines behind them closed the final distance, their presence now undeniable, and beside him she turned her head toward him, her gaze steady, no longer distant, no longer analytical, but present in a way that felt unmistakably aware, and she spoke, her voice calm, certain. "You understand the outcome." And Daniel nodded once. A small movement, not dramatic, just honest. "Yeah," he said quietly, and there was no fear in it, no regret, just the simple acknowledgement of what was. And she studied him for a moment longer, something deeper moving behind her eyes, something that had not been there when he found her. And then she said, "Then why remain?" And this time he did look at her, fully, meeting her gaze without hesitation, without deflection, and for a second the noise outside, the pressure, the approaching presence, all of it faded into the background, because the question mattered more, and his answer came just as simply as the ones before, "Because you are not something to leave behind." And the words were quiet, but they carried weight, not because they were profound, but because they were true, and something changed then, not in the environment, not in the sound of the engines as they arrived overhead, but in her, the glow along her skin shifting one final time, not brighter, but warmer, softer, the rigid pattern dissolving into something more fluid, more alive, and the systems inside the truck responded instantly, stabilizing completely, then extending beyond their limits. Energy routing through circuits that had not been active before, the console displaying outputs that exceeded design parameters, and Daniel felt it, not as a jolt, not as a force, but as a transition, as if the space around them had shifted in a way that the human senses were not built to fully understand. And the air outside went quiet, unnaturally so, the sound of the pursuing craft cutting off mid-approach, replaced by a stillness that did not belong to the desert, and Daniel's grip on the wheel loosened slightly as he looked forward again, the horizon no longer the same, the light bending in subtle ways that suggested distance had changed, that position had changed, and beside him she exhaled slowly, her posture relaxing for the first time, not from weakness, but from release. And when he glanced at her again, her expression was different, not alien, not distant, but something closer to understanding, and she said, softly, "You chose deviation." And Daniel let out a small breath, almost a smile, but not quite, eyes returning to the road that no longer led back to where they had come from. "Yeah," he said, and then after a brief pause, "Seems like it worked," and the desert, for the first time since this began, said nothing at all.